Hi, my name is Jessica Russell, and I'm going to be giving a presentation over my project called Poverty on Reservations, a Bigger Problem Than Many People Realize. This project is part of my INTS Capstone 4350 course. The abstract for my paper is as follows. Generally speaking, when someone thinks about a Native American reservation, the first thought that pops into their head is the vast amount of casinos. Although many reservations do have casinos, they are still considered to have some of the highest rates of poverty. The purpose of this project is to discuss current research regarding poverty on reservations and use interdisciplinary research to create a solution. I will be combining the disciplines of history, sociology, and psychology to analyze the issue of poverty on reservation lands and to think of a solution. This topic is very complex, which makes it an interdisciplinary problem. Analyzing this topic using only one discipline would be inadequate in providing the necessary information to create a solution. There is a variety of data which shows the statistical numbers of poverty on reservations and the issues it creates on those reservations. Some of these issues include mental health problems, demographics on the reservation, poor quality of education, and many others. So in order to fully understand why there's so many issues on reservations surrounding poverty and why there are such high poverty levels, you have to understand the history of the U.S. government and Native American relations. So as follows is the key historical events that have shaped some of this mistrust and other issues. So in 1851, the first treaty of Fort Laramie was made, clearly making the boundaries of the Lakota Nation. However, this treaty was violated by the Homestead Act. The act was signed by President Lincoln, allowing white settlers to go on to native lands. In 1863, an uprising on Santee Sioux in Minnesota ends with the hanging of 38 Sioux men, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. The execution was ordered by President Lincoln only 2 days after he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1868, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty clearly guarantees the sovereignty of the Great Sioux Nation and the Lakota's ownership to the sacred Black Hills. The Black Hills is a territory very sacred to the Lakota tribe, and in order for them to create this treaty, they had to have those lands. In 1871, the Indian Appropriation Act makes all Indians wards of the federal government. In addition, the military issued orders forbidding Western Indians from leaving reservations. In 1874, General George Custer announced the discovery of gold in Lakota territory, specifically the Black Hills. The tribe did not want the white settlers or white men on sacred grounds, which resulted in the Lakota War. A new treaty was created which chiefs were told they had to sign or they would starve. However, only 10% of the chiefs actually signed, even though the treaty was required to be signed by 3/4 of the tribe chiefs. In 1887, the Dawes Act was put into place. This is the act correlated with the Trail of Tears. It is the act that created reservations, and Native Americans were forced onto the reservations with this act. In 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred. This massacre was involving U.S. troops and the Sioux Nation. U.S. troops surrounded a Sioux encampment at Wounded Knee Creek and massacred Chief Bigfoot and 300 prisoners of war. This massacre created great tensions between the Native Americans and the U.S. government, which still exists today. Today, the burial site is sacred to the tribe and represents another tragedy faced by the Sioux Nation. In 1980, Sioux Nation versus the United States is a Supreme Court case. The reason this court case came about was that the terms of the Second Fort Laramie Treaty had been violated. Basically, this was when Custer had found gold and the white settlers began to go into the Black Hills for that gold. The court determined that the treaty was broken and that the Black Hills were obtained illegally. The courts awarded the amount they deemed fair, but the Sioux Nation wanted their sacred lands back and not the financial compensation. Sociology. This provides actual statistics regarding how poverty directly impacts Native Americans on reservations. So, for education, 82.4% of Native Americans have obtained a high school diploma or GED. However, that's far less than the 86.9% of the United States overall population. As for income, the median household income on a reservation is $37,227. This is compared to the national median income of $53,657. So you can see there's a pretty big gap between those incomes. And housing, 53% of Native Americans own their own homes on a reservation, and that's far less than the 63.1% of the overall population in the United States who own their own homes. So in some of the research I found, this comes from the demographic factors associated with poverty amongst American Indians and Native Alaska Natives, race and social problems. And in there it says, the U.S. federal regulation of tribes/nations and tribal enrollment limits who may be enrolled in a tribe and determines which tribes will receive federal recognition. Reservations tend to be located in rural areas which limit economic opportunity. Each of these elements in turn limits the socioeconomic opportunities of American Indians as a historic people in the USA. All American Indians, regardless of racial identity or tribal affiliation, are more likely to experience either absolute poverty or relative poverty compared to the non-Hispanic whites. The absolute poverty rate for all American Indians is 23.1%, and the relative poverty rate is 39%. Both rates for American Indians are considerably higher than those for non-Hispanic whites, who have a 9.5% absolute poverty rate and an 18.5% relative poverty rate. The poverty rates for American Indians are thus over twice as high as for non-Hispanic whites. In general, the demographic characteristics of American Indians show expected patterns in regard to the odds of experiencing poverty. For example, American Indians are more likely to be poor due to their lower levels of education and their greater proportions residing in non-metropolitan areas. Right. So sociology continued. Less than half of the greater chances of American Indians being in poverty is statistically explained by age, gender, education, metropolitan status, and region of residence. The remaining greater chances of being in poverty may reflect other unmeasured variables such as reduced migration opportunities, geographic isolation, limited tribal economic development, disadvantages, school quality, or racial discrimination in the labor market. Results from a study conducted showed that poverty continues to be a notable problem among American Indians because their poverty levels are well above non-Hispanic whites with otherwise comparable demographic characteristics. As for the psychology perspective, some of the research found shows that in a national survey of more than 13,000 youths in grades 7 through 12 drawn from 200 reservation-based schools, a factor analysis of 30 risk behaviors was conducted. Among the 7 risk factors derived from this analysis was one including violence and gang involvement. This factor was correlated with other risk behaviors such as alcohol and drug use, suicide attempts, and vandalism, stealing, and truancy. They also found that national injury and mortality data shows that American Indian and Alaska Native children are more likely to be killed in a motor vehicle accident, to be hit by a car, to commit suicide, or to be drowned than either their African American or white peers. The study also showed that American Indian and Alaska Native children are also exposed to repeated loss because of the extremely high rate of early, unexpected, and traumatic deaths due to injuries, accidents, suicide, homicide, and firearms, all of which exceed the U.S. all races rate by at least 2 times. And due to alcoholism, which exceeds the U.S. all races rate by 7 times, among adults, exposure to such events is high, ranging from 19% to 46% depending on the type of event. And research has showed that all of these are linked to the poverty levels found on the reservations. Psychology continued. Child maltreatment. There are both immediate and long-term effects of child maltreatment within the American Indian and Alaska Native population, including high rates of mental disorders, substance abuse, suicidal behavior, and behavioral and relationship problems among maltreated individuals. Once again, poverty has been linked to the high rate of childhood maltreatment. The study also found that disruptive behavior disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and other substance use disorders were diagnosed in 13.8%, 5.5%, 4.6%, and 3.9% of children. In comparison, rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, substance abuse, and dependence and conduct and oppositional defiant disorder were elevated relative to published rates for non-native children. Another startling statistic about the way poverty influences the children on the reservations is that suicide rate is 3 to 6 times higher among American Indian and Alaska Native than among their non-native peers, and indeed represents one of the greatest health disparities faced by young American Indian and Alaska Natives. The physical and mental disparities faced by American Indian and Alaska Native populations can, in part, be accounted for by the serious lack of funding for healthcare within the IHS system and by the number of American Indians and Alaska Native people not served by the IHS who are without any other form of health insurance and benefit. School settings today can play an important role in fostering American Indian and Alaska Native children's development in culturally supportive ways. However, since the funding is lower because it is a poverty-ridden area, there's not as much funding for education. So in conclusion, my solutions would be to provide better funding for education, schools, and reservations through the U.S. government, somehow providing more funding. Research has shown when the education is better in schools, the suicide rates and other mental health issues decreases. Another solution would be consider creating more job opportunities for Native Americans. Research showed because Native Americans are isolated on reservations and not able to commute to metropolitan areas, that they're not able to make as much income. So by providing an outlet so they can sell their goods in those metropolitan areas can increase their income. Also considering giving them the taxes that are taken from casinos on the reservation and putting it back into the reservation for education purposes and other things that need to be funded to prevent poverty from being a reoccurring thing is another solution. And then acknowledging the treaties that are put in place and consistently violated, as mentioned earlier in the presentation with regards to the history perspective. And working on regaining trust amongst Natives through working hands-on with the BLM and BIA. Thank y'all for listening to my presentation. Hope y'all enjoyed.